Good evening, everyone. I'm Heather Deck. I'm the Executive Director of Sound Rivers. It's great to have so many with us this evening. I also wanted to just a quick introduction. We have Corinne Everett Belch, our Director of Development, that's on the call, helping me out tonight. And excited to be here. This is part of our science series, Tell Me About It Tuesday, where we bring in researchers and community activists that are doing great work within the Noosa Tar Pamlico to kind of share their experiences and understanding. And so we're looking forward to hearing from Dr. Dahl. Some of you may remember we had Dr. Dahl with us, I think in the first couple of months that we did this back when the pandemic started, and talking about her work on plastic pollution. I've known Dr. Dahl for a number of years. We've worked together on doing green stormwater infrastructure projects. So our campus stormwater work that we do was started with a collaboration with Dr. Dahl. So I'm pleased to have her here tonight. So we're going to talk tonight about natural systems, about improving our community resilience to riverine flooding. Dr. Dahl is at NC State. She's an extension associate professor and restoration specialist with the North Carolina Sea Grant. And her work is focused on what's called non-point source pollution prevention, basically pollution that comes in the form of runoff, not out of a pipe. She works on restoration ecology, stormwater management, stream assessments and restoration, and landscaping. Has been a great successful in getting lots of wonderful grants to do great work here in North Carolina. So welcome, Dr. Dahl. We'll turn it over to you.
Oh, great. Thanks. It's good to be with y'all tonight. I'm working out of my home, so it's not quite the office environment, but I appreciate everybody taking the time to come and listen to some of the work that we've been doing. Right off, I want to acknowledge all the partners and my colleagues. I have a team of engineers, Dan Line and Dr. Jack Cricky Fox, that really do a lot of the modeling and kind of very technical analysis work for our projects. And so a lot of what I'm presenting is really their hard effort. So I want to acknowledge them. And then you'll see a lot of logos on the slide. We've been partnering with a number of agencies and NGOs to really start to take a hard look at flooding and ways we could mitigate it with natural infrastructure, or some people call it nature-based solutions. We've been hit with 3 major floods in about a 20-year period when you went between Floyd and Florence that caused billions of dollars of damage, lots of rescues, emergency rescues, and fatalities, unfortunately, and damage to agriculture as well. So we want to really kind of try to address that problem in a creative way, kind of try to do things differently than we have in the past. So nature-based solutions are one of the things that have been discussed over the last several years. I've been collaborating with folks in the Netherlands. This is something they're even, talking a lot about and starting to attempt new projects and approaches with this. And this was a good question for us because here at NC State University, where we led this project, because we have done a lot of work with restoration over more than 2 decades. And with our College of Forestry, they have done a lot with forest recovery as well. So we wanted to look at how can we use these natural systems out there to potentially reduce flooding, as I mentioned before. Next slide. Why is that? Okay, there we go. It's a little bit of a delay, sorry. So our approach has been, we want to look for opportunity. Where can we put these things? Then we want to model what we call the hydrology and figure out what kind of flow reduction can we achieve. If we distribute these things throughout a drainage network, then what does that mean to flows during these extreme events? We also model the river hydraulics. That's the water moving down the river, and look at what type of changes in water surface we see and what reductions in flooding will result. We've also done some work looking at the water quality benefits and modeling that and estimating the cost as well of some of this work. Well, our first effort kind of looking at natural infrastructure was a small project funded by the Environmental Defense Fund. And we looked at 2 creeks in Goldsboro. One of those was called Big Ditch. This Big Ditch has a fairly small watershed of about 3 square miles. It's mostly developed. The channel has been straightened. You see a lot of this armoring with concrete throughout this channel, and it has lots of crossings over the streams where roads go across it at every block in certain neighborhoods. 22 crossings in all, and about 16 of those are very undersized and overtop and as little as a 10-year storm. Now, Hurricane Matthew was around a 100-year storm, so a 10-year storm is much smaller than that in scale. And so what we wanted to do is kind of normally, I'm an actual civil engineer first, is a lot of civil engineers will kind of look at the bridges and the culverts and say, well, a lot of those are undersized. How can we upgrade those and address flooding? Well, in addition to that, we wanted to consider, well, what if we did a stream restoration project here and we widened out the floodplain, remeandered the stream, planted it, and increased the kind of floodway for this big ditch, the creek. And so we actually made a channel with a floodplain, and the floodplain is 6 times wider than the channel. So the black is the existing. And so this is how we're showing widening it out to be a more naturally formed stream. Well, what we found, we looked at each thing individually and in combination, and that the only way to really reduce flooding is we had to do both. We had to do the kind of gray infrastructure repair, and we had to do the green infrastructure work. So this blue line shows the hydraulic model. The water surface profile reads from right to left. And so the blue line is the existing water surface during a 500-year event. 500, this is well above Hurricane Matthew. And with both things done, we can see the water line is now in red. The new, with this combined approach, really brings that water level down, even in a 500-year event. So the way to really achieve success is to have a combined multi-prong approach. And this map here shows you the big ditch, and the blue is the existing flood print, or the footprint of flooding in the 100-year storm. And then the red is with those combined measures of addressing those undersized bridges and culverts, eliminating redundant crossings, because we had every street here has a crossing. So we actually removed redundant and then just upsized the larger ones to be efficient. So it's a very short 3 blocks or 2 blocks to go around and drive around that. And so the new flood print is much smaller. Now, this does require buying out homes in the floodway. So all the structures that are within that area, we want to recover the floodplain and build a more naturalized stream to give capacity, would have to still be removed. So you have to have buyout of structures, the stream restoration project, and the improvements to culverts. And I want to stress that multi-prong approaches. Next, we looked at Stony Creek, which has a more unique situation in that the upper half of the watershed is undeveloped, mostly agricultural land. And then the lower half of the watershed is the developed area through Goldsboro, and they have flooding problems in the lower section. In fact, at the road that leads to the hospital often is flooded. So we wanted to look at different natural infrastructure scenarios to see, could we achieve any benefit if we use this kind of upper area to store more water and reduce runoff? So we looked at storage and retention. So you see these blue hatched areas. These were areas that we looked at putting in low berms of about 2 foot with control structures that would be, at any given time would be open to flow at the structure. But if a big storm's coming, close the gate off and hold water back and store water in these areas. And we also looked at reforesting this entire upper watershed, which is about 30% of the watershed. And we looked at this in combination, these 2 approaches. And what we found is with the peak flow that we could achieve about a 28% reduction in flow. And this is for even all the way up to the 500-year storm event. So we could achieve significant peak flow reductions with this combined approach of the two. So we have individually, this is storage, this is the reforestation, and the red gets you the most when you combine those approaches. Comes a delay. So this small project in Goldsboro led to a much bigger project. It was funded by the NC Policy Collaboratory, where we wanted to look at the whole Middle Neuse Basin. So everything below the Falls Dam down to Kinston, and what could we possibly achieve in this watershed, or river basin, excuse me. So what our approach was is we found these three smaller watersheds in the Middle Neuse, the Little River, the Nahunta, and the Bear Creek, that have these USGS flow gauges on them. And we modeled these subbasins very closely, very detailed, and then use that to extrapolate to the full basin. So we not only modeled hydrology, we looked at water quality benefits of these nature-based solutions in the watersheds. And we also did quite a bit of cost analysis working with partners at UNC Chapel Hill and at NC State College of Forestry. So we identified in all three of these study basins opportunities. We did the kind of geospatial overlays of soils and topography and land use. And we came up with, this is where we think these activities could occur, these practices. Well, then we went to the watersheds and we ground truth that. We found 241 potential sites we were looking at. And we found that we had a lot of issues with some of the sites that were identified just through that mapping. So then we got really more detail with what type of areas would be suitable, like, and refined our analysis to get to what was more accurate areas. Well, we did consider this concept of water farming. Basically, these are engineered systems that are going to slow down the water. It requires that you put a berm around farmland, but that and an outlet structure at one or two or maybe even several points at that ditch. The outlet structures are open most of the time. Everything's water's flowing out like normal. But again, if a big storm's coming, you close that gate off and hold the water back on the farm. It would take 1 day to maybe 3 or 4 days, depending on the location you are, to allow the water down the river to reach its peak and start coming back down before you can open the gate back up. What we found is the most appropriate locations were, of course, agricultural lands that are not already in the floodplain. You know, they're not already being flooded. There's no structures or roads that would be flooded, homes, hog barns, whatever it is. And the slope needs to be less than about 1.1%. Otherwise, you would have to have very tall berms and more frequent berms to hold the water back. And we looked at contiguous acres of at least 20 acres. So it was a substantial area for storing it. This picture shows an example of a water farm in Florida. They're doing this more for nutrient management because they're holding the water back, allowing time for the nutrients to be taken up and processed in the field before it goes to downstream water. So we actually did designs of these. We looked at different sites we identified, figured out, okay, well, how much berm am I going to need? What's the downstream end? How many structures? And then this allowed us, using this topographic data, to also calculate how much water could be stored in this area. So this helped us not only with our modeling, but also to do cost estimation of this. We did 10 to 12 sites in this, looking at it. And then this helped us refine, again, that geospatial analysis. So here is the Bear Creek watershed. The yellow areas show where water farming was appropriate. Here's Nahunta Farm, showing in yellow hatched areas where it was appropriate. And then we used what we learned and extrapolated to the full Middle Neuse. And what we found is we really had no opportunity in the upper part of the basin. It was all concentrated to the lower basin because, again, the slopes were just too steep up here, and we had more development in parts of the upper watershed. Down here, we had flatter slopes and more open areas, less developed. So for the wetlands that we looked at, typical wetland restoration in North Carolina, a lot of that's been done in the eastern part of the state, where they often cap the ditches or fill the ditches, put in some micro topography, and then plant it. And it really works like a natural wetland. However, these types of wetlands are pretty full by the time a storm comes and they don't have storage capacity. So this was not the type of wetland that we were looking at. We wanted to have something that had a storage component. So it was a wetland, but it's also going to have a berm have a berm at the outlet, a pipe to regulate the flow, to slow it down. But water would be very low in this at any given time so that wetland plants would thrive, but it would have this storage above that for the bigger storm events. So we did a lot of really detailed analysis with digital elevation models, finding the right size channels, because you want to place a wetland where it would have some area that's draining to it. So you had some water to hold back and really give that flood control benefit. So these wetlands were then sized here, each wetland to be about 10% of the drainage area. And the drainage area would be at least 35 acres. That was our kind of criteria. So here for Bear Creek, we can see the wetlands in red and the area draining to each wetland in blue. Here's Nahunta, not quite as much opportunity as Bear Creek there. And then we extrapolated the same process, what we learned through that analysis, extrapolated out to the full basin. And we actually did the same thing where we did mock designs for many sites to get a handle on cost and berm height and this type of stuff for our analysis. So here we have the concentrated areas for wetlands. Again, we're in the lower part of the basin because again, slope and more open land are available to create these wetlands. We just don't have much opportunity, much less in these upper part of the basins. Well, then we also looked at reforestation and we focused on low productivity cropland. You wouldn't want to take your most productive croplands and convert them to trees because, you know, of course, we need to grow food, right? So in Bear Creek, the lower part of the basin had a lot of opportunity. In Nahunta, not as much opportunity. There's a lot of cropland, but it's very high productivity. And then in Little River, we actually had a significant amount in Little River in the upper part of the watershed. So again, we extrapolated our process and identified it. And so you'll see the forestry opportunities more distributed in the watershed, but still some areas just really having a lot more opportunity than others. For the full Middle Neuse, you can see the percentages over here to the right. I actually can't see my percentages. So we had 8.4% of the full Middle Neuse basin. So then we built this really detailed model for each of these study watersheds, and then inserted where we had this opportunity, different practices, storage, and changed runoff relationships in this model to simulate those nature-based solutions in these drainage areas. So that's showing you how the model gets manipulated to add the storage and changes in runoff. So what we can see here is the Nahunta Swamp. And so we have the percentages here. So we had a lot of wetland potential on this watershed, a little bit of water farming, not as much reforestation. And you can see where we have about, with the combined effort, we end up with about 13.6% reduction in flow for a Hurricane Matthew event. So that was a good amount of reduction. However, that equated to about 0.4 feet reduction in water surface in the river because we're already well out onto the floodplain. So we have to reduce, we don't get as much reduction. It's not going to take the water down by 2 or 3 feet. So in Bear Swamp, we have our percentages of the practices we found here. We had a lot of wetland opportunity, a lot of reforestation, moderate and water farming. With the combined practices together, we got a 21.8% reduction in the peak discharge for Hurricane Floyd event. That was our kind of calibration event for Bear Creek on that. So that was substantial. And that would give you about a 1 foot reduction in water surface. And this is really due to a lot higher level. So basically, depending on how much you put out there is going to really correlate to how much reduction that you get. My dog's whining, sorry. So we then extrapolated the reductions to the other subbasins based on how much opportunity were in those other subbasins of the river. So you can see the reductions in peak discharge for hurricane event our 100-year event were much less in the upper basin because we just didn't have much opportunity. And a lot of it was the some big reductions down in the lower part, even reaching 20–30% reductions in peak discharge. We looked at the communities moving down the river, Smithfield, Goldsboro, and Kinston, to see what kind of reductions that we got. Well, in Smithfield, we have almost no reduction because remember the upper part of the basin just doesn't have much opportunity. Whereas compared to the lower part, we got 4.4% for Goldsboro and 5.3% for Kinston. This equated to less than a half a foot reduction in the water surface on the river. But the damages, let me just show you. So looking at a cross section of the river, you can see when we're in a 100-year event or even Hurricane Matthew, these are the river channel and the bridges here. And we're way out onto the floodplain. The blue line shows us where the water is. So even if we had a 1 foot reduction in the water surface, we're going to still have extensive flooding of the floodplain. So anytime you're above a 20, 25, 50-year event, you're already out of the channel well into a floodplain. That's the natural form of our rivers and channels, is to have a channel and a floodplain. So again, we're not talking about changing the big footprint of flooding. We're just bringing the water down a little bit. But even the small reduction in those in Goldsboro and Smithfield resulted in some significant damage reductions for our different design storms. We have a 25-year storm, 50, 100, 500-year storm. The damages reduced were between 7 and 21%, with the greatest damage reduction happening at the 50-year storm. So we also modeled water quality in the Bear Creek and the Hunter Swamp, and we found that greater than 15% reduction in total nitrogen and total phosphorus in Bear Creek. Little River, where we only put in mostly forestry and only 6% of the watershed, that still gave us significant reductions, 12% and 17% reduction in TNTP. So there's a big water quality benefit. In fact, it would cover a good portion of the construction cost of the wetlands just through the reductions that we would achieve through that. I do want to focus quickly on the Grand Forks, North Dakota area. In 1997, they had a major flood. They also had a fire in this community. So they kind of were dealing with flood way back, even back when we had Hurricane Floyd. And so what they did, and I picked this town because it's a fairly small town, and in eastern North Carolina, other than Wilmington, we really don't have a lot of big cities there. So what they did was they did buyout of repetitive lost structures, about 50 homes. They did have to build a protective, flexible flood wall and levee system to protect their downtown area. Then they implemented a park and greenway system all along the river. So they didn't say, oh, we're getting stuff out and it's a wasteland. They said, we're going to do something else with this area. And so here you can see this is the flexible flood wall being constructed because they couldn't move their downtown area. And they actually close off the bridges when big floods come to kind of protect that downtown. But then they also program this greenway space out to have lots of events there, even have biking, boating events, cross-country skiing. So this added a lot of value to their community by getting these repeat loss structures. Nobody wants to see abandoned homes that are there flooded out. So they did this conversion of the area to something useful. We also see in the Netherlands where they're starting to change their approach and give more area for the river. They call it rooms the river. So they're moving levees back. They are changing some of the bridge openings on the river, and they are expanding the capacity for the river because the best use of these floodplains is for floodplain flow. So just kind of wrapping up with some conclusions, communities in North Carolina, they're going to need help tackling flood issues. They need financial, technical assistance all the way through the whole process of analysis, design, planning, and implementation. I want to reinforce innovative approaches are where it's at. It's not just one thing. We're going to have to do the kind of gray infrastructure, the green infrastructure, and keep getting things out of the floodplain, buyout and elevation, which we've been doing a lot of. So we're going to have to expand to these other areas. We've got to better communicate the risk and the uncertainty of future flooding. We've done a lot of modeling to show floods are going to get worse as we move to the end of the century, and that even a 100-year storm, we have a 1% annual chance of that happening any given year. But over a 30-year period, that means 26% chance of that structure in the floodplain being flooded. So we've got to get those structures out of the floodplain because they will flood. We've got to identify a place for water and a place for people because water will always win. And the most important use of floodplains is to store water. Recovering floodplains, though, can be beneficial opportunities for communities. It does not have to be a loss. We can convert that into a win for each community. And I want to just show you this web page here where we've posted a lot of our work looking at projects for DOT on flood mitigation and the work, some of the work I've presented here to you tonight. And I apologize for my dog crying and all the racket. Anyway, I hope you were able to get the content there.
Thank you, Barbara. That was great. And yeah, I think all of us at home are understanding with pets that we have dogs. My kitten was running across the table a minute ago. So, but that was truly fascinating. I appreciate all of that information. There's a lot to chew on, and I'm sure there's some questions. And so I'm going to kind of open the floor for folks to feel comfortable. We are, an easy crowd here. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question directly, please don't hesitate to do that. I'd love to hear your question. You also can use the chat function. And if you're shy and you'd rather just sort of chat your question, please go ahead and do that. So let me just pause for a minute, see if anybody wants to unmute and has a question. Otherwise, I'll kick us off with one here. Okay, not yet. Well, I will kick us off. So Barbara, I know you had a chance to kind of talk to elected officials about, some of this research. I think recently, Representative Murphy and some others had put one together. There's clearly a lot of federal funding and now some state funding coming down related to kind of wetland mitigation and some other things. But I'm just kind of curious, and that was a good thing, but as we hopefully continue to get some more funding coming down to deal with this, with mitigation and resiliency, you sort of mentioned, the kind of the opportunities that are there, but knowing that the need is enormous and the amount of money right now is limited, how might you best prioritize kind of the use of those funds based off of your research?
Well, I think that, we took a big step in kind of looking at what types of practices can be used, how much water they can store, like kind of looking at the density of, you put this much out, this is kind of reductions you can expect. But I think that's why, the Division of Mitigation Services has been funded. They put out this call to do the blueprint. And I think that's what they're wanting and needing, is to kind of take that in the next step. Like, how do we prioritize what areas? I mean, most certainly if you want to concentrate these, if we do one tiny wetland here and one tiny wetland over in this river basin over here, we're not going to get there, right? So in other words, we see that when we start getting the percentages higher, 10, 12, 20% of the watershed with some kind of practice, we're going to start to see some notable changes. So it has to be done in a more concentrated way. So I think they're going to have to look at where is the downstream problem, and is the scale of that problem such that this would be beneficial. So some of it, the scale is so big, they may have to just really work on buyout, like really just stay on that. But in other areas, maybe they've got a few roads that flood, they can maybe address the bridge. And if they did some natural infrastructure above, they might be able to bring the water levels down, combining with that and actually maximizing their, optimizing the funding. So I think it's going to need more collaboration between like DOT, these communities, Division of Mitigation Services, and really put our heads together and optimize those solutions. Because again, it won't be one thing, and it won't be one little thing here and there and there. But I think most certainly there are water management improvement needs in our state, not just from a flooding standpoint. I think we have to also consider across a range of flow conditions, from drought and how we could do these things smart to provide irrigation water or to hold water levels up. And so there's not stress on crops, because we know drought can stress crops. Then at more regular flows, really to make sure it's functioning well for water quality, because most of the time we're in that mid-range of flow, that we're protecting downstream habitats and species and water quality. And that then we also have this thing set up to do that, make hold water back during big storms. So I think, we did a focus on flooding, with some water quality, but to really, when these systems come in, they really need to be tailored to the site. They need to be designed with kind of knowing the downstream situation that you're trying to fix, and, to really optimize again and think across a range of flow conditions. And so like DOT had, there's this term one water. So in other words, you're thinking about water in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
We've been very siloed, I think, in the past. And so we've got more integration.
Yeah, that's great. And we've got a question then from Carl. Carl was curious about, is the insurance industry, do you have any knowledge of the insurance industry kind of calculating the damage risks and cost of maybe future flooding?
Yeah, I know they've done some work where they, I've seen some in our work when we're kind of looking this up. We don't do the detailed FEMA cost benefit analysis for our work. We've done some more simplified. I have a whole, for a longer presentation, I cover some of the costing stuff we've done that just adds a lot more to this. So I know we didn't have time tonight, but so there's a lot of ways you could go at it. The FEMA has a kind of traditional cost benefit analysis that they do on all projects to say, well, are we going to fix this bridge or raise this road or do a reservoir, whatever. So we've been trying to kind of get close to that with some of our work. Now, and I have seen studies where they talked about if we went to the 500-year flood, get people out of that, use that as the limit and say, you got to be above that, or you increase the freeboard. Like right now, it's, I think 2 foot above the 100 years, the freeboard. Well, if you raise it up, that how much the cost savings would be. There's been a lot of FEMA analysis of that, and it's pretty impressive. And so the one thing is, I think a lot of people think, oh, the 500-year flood, that's just so much land we can't develop in. But the footprint of the 500-year flood is very little difference between the 100 and the 500 in most locations, because it's still in that floodplain. So it's more of an elevation game. So if they are, but so if you pushed it out to the 500-year floodplain, then you would not, take up more room this way. It's just kind of getting people out of a small fringe and higher would be what it is. So I think it makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people push back on that, not really kind of looking at those flood maps and figuring out what does that actually mean. I think the differential is not huge.
Yeah, for those of us that have been flooded, we know how much even a foot makes a difference, for sure. Other questions? Is there anyone that wants to unmute and ask a question?
Well,
John, did I see you?
Yeah,
Yes.
this is Uli. I'm on Mary's line here. It's sort of complicated. I'm not sure I have it clearly formulated in my mind. But if you could speculate on reforesting the upper reaches of the creeks and watersheds that are currently the high value agricultural areas, and what it would cost to do that, meaning buyouts, I suppose, versus the capacity of having these reforested areas absorbing more water and thus reducing the flood danger for the higher populated areas, the Kinston towns and Goldsboro towns, further downstream. If you can speculate maybe on either the effect that the reforestation would have, and B, on whether that the cost for that would be made up by the savings in damage control further down the stream.
Right. And so in our report, we summarize some of that it's like for instance, the flood control wetlands, I think their water storage per acre is 6 times the reforestation. But they're the most expensive because we're talking about excavating out and having this berm, to get the berm. So it's a lot more work. So there is kind of a cap on the reforestation, and it depends on the watershed. But again, if you took and reforested half a watershed, you could expect 30–40% reductions in peak flow for some of these events. Now, it does depend on the events. Like we actually see differences when we model Matthew in some cases versus the kind of 100-year storm. And we saw better benefits in Matthew than the 100-year storm. And that was because the rainfall was more distributed in Matthew. So if kind of these practices fall where that rain was, then we got greater reductions. Whereas the 100-year design storm is more evenly distributed. So it would really have to be kind of, again, modeled very specifically. And we even looked a lot at the different studies in Europe and other parts of the US where people have modeled. And yeah, we see, like some was reforesting a whole watershed that was in pasture to forest, and they were like 40–50% reduction in peak discharges. So it would depend on the previous land use and kind of the runoff characteristics and that. But roughly with like water farming and wetlands, we see that a part of the watershed you affect. So the wetlands, you're not just putting the footprint of the wetland, you're controlling that watershed above it. That if you affect about 10% of the watershed, you're going to get about a 10% reduction with the wetlands and water farming. It kind of roughly equated to how much area you changed to the outcome.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you for that. And thank you, Uli, for your question. I think John Crystal has a question for you, Barbara. Do you have a question, John? There you go.
Yeah. Can you hear me? No.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, a few years ago, there was a change in the floodplains and the classifications of them along the Pamlico here. And I was just wondering, who did that, and was that a good thing or not? Reducing people, along the shorelines requirement for flood insurance and all that sort of thing.
I'm not familiar with the changes that took place on the Pamlico, but the state does the mapping. They have hydraulic models, and they're period. They have a big need to re-update their models. Some like, for instance, the Noose model down the river is from the 80s, big sections of it. So they need to really update that model. But they're, that's one of the things they're working to get funding on. So they model those rivers and map those 100-year and 500-year storms. So if they did an update on risk with their modeling, then that could be. I know they've had some changes with the storm surge and wave calculations for the coast. So I don't know if it was that or not. I saw a very good presentation. I'm not as well versed in some of their rules and that with the setbacks and stuff, but I saw a very good presentation by, I think his name's Steve Garrett with North Carolina Emergency Management, and they actually recorded that presentation. It was for the board of the Land and Water Fund that's working on this. They've got that new money coming in for flood mitigation. So that might be a good, it was a short presentation for you to get. And he had some really excellent explanations of the setbacks, and he might be a really good person to email as well. I can share that with Heather after.
Okay. Thanks.
Mhm.
Yeah, that'd be great. We can then get that information out to everybody that's interested as well. Other questions? I'm sure there's some other questions here. Feel free to unmute or throw them in the chat if you'd like. I will go ahead. I have another question, Barbara, while we're waiting to see if any others come up. But, one of the things that we hear a lot of kind of concerns about for folks that have lived, all their life, grew up on the river, that the sediment fill that's kind of happening over time, which is sort of a natural transition with rivers. But they speak a lot of sort of questioning why aren't we dredging? I think the tar was dredged maybe over 100 years ago. I think one time was the last time it was done. Not sure about the news. Most of the dredging projects now are on the coast related to, ports and access for larger boats. But I'm wondering if you have any, research or what you've seen, or is that sort of a need for here in North Carolina to kind of understand that may not be a solution, or the costs and benefits of that.
Yeah, we have not modeled any of the dredging. I know that AECOM looked at dredging on the news with their models they did for North Carolina Emergency Management. And they showed a flood reduction in Kinston. However, they really did not go very deep looking at the maintenance of that, because what happens is you might dredge that sand out, but there's a continual supply that comes every storm. And so it's just kind of fill back up. In fact, if when they dredge, if they kind of widen the river any, it fills up quicker because it's kind of more surface that the water's in contact with, and friction is what kind of slows the water down and it begins to fill up. So it's not something I recommend, because I think you personally, I think you could have one big storm after that would refill it back up. All the work you could spend millions and millions of dollars dredging, and you get that one storm that just brings this massive load. And I think that's very likely to occur. And I don't know how much detail they provided on their kind of quick look at maintenance, but the AECOM, the contractor, was like, we know this would be very difficult to permit, and we don't think our analysis of sediment transport is very well done, because rivers don't only move water, they move sediment and energy. And so that has to be considered. And so I think I personally don't recommend it. And I think that to get at this issue, it might take somebody to really evaluate it more in more detail than what that effort did. But I don't see our state pursuing it.
Thank you. That's helpful. That's helpful. Other questions that folks might have for Dr. Dahl? I might throw another one at you, but I want to wait and give some space for some others to ask some questions. Feel free to chat if you don't want to unmute. So with water farming, one of the things I can imagine is obviously you want to be growing crops on this, but then at times when we have some flooding, we need to like transfer that into water storage. And are there models or other places where they've thought about the compensation? I'm assuming there's some compensation because obviously they're providing a service, to the broader community, but didn't know if you could speak to that.
Some of the, now say again, the complications.
Like compensation, like financial
Compensation, okay, yeah.
compensation, yeah.
Yeah, as part of our study, the UNC Chapel Hill, they actually did a kind of workshop with the farmers. And they kind of laid out this concept and said, you know, what would it, how many acres would you have now you potentially enroll in a program? So these were actual landowners. B, here's all these different leasing agreements. What would be suitable for you? And, you know, if you know, the gates would be open most of the time, you'd only close them in big storms. And when your land is flooded, you would be compensated for the damage in addition to the lease. So they were like, So they preferred the 30-year lease with an upfront payment. And they then also outlined their questions and concerns. But the very positive thing that, like, the Farm Bureau guy said was they didn't close the door, because a lot of them, the acres they put in, when these big storms come, it's, you know, low-lying areas of the field that get flooded already. Even though the water goes away, it's so saturated, they're not able often to get the crops out. And so they lose the crops, and they're not getting that, you know, payment for that. The crop insurance, you know, they'll get that, but then that's based on the last 3 years of your production. So if you get one of these storms, and that brings your production down for that previous 3 years. So they felt that that part of the equation would make it a more secure bet for them. They also then listed out what other concerns. One, you know, they were like, if water sat on this field for several days, what does it do to the soils? They wanted to really know more, like how long the water is going to sit. And so that was, you know, concern for the health of the soil. So I think there needs to be some demonstration projects now, and kind of all these different questions to look at this, and kind of look at the outlet control structures and the berming, every aspect of it, and do that even on maybe one of the university research farms or NCDA farms or something, and test this out. I think that's the next step.
That's fascinating,
Heather?
because one of our,
go
yeah,
ahead.
Mary, go ahead. No,
Well,
yeah,
I think it's interesting that there has not been one mention in this whole talk about sea level rise. I mean, half our watershed is going to be underwater in 70 years. And if I were a farmer, or the state of North Carolina that may be going to fund some of this, I would sure want to know. I don't know. It just seems interesting to me that you haven't mentioned it. I'm not saying you should, but I just am curious why you haven't, that's all.
Well, the area that we were looking at is above Kinston. So it's above even the tidal portions of the river. So yeah, lower down, like, or if you were looking at Hyde County and Tyrrell County and stuff like that, well, yeah, then sea level rise needs to be considered. But we were working more upper kind of middle New Basin, where we're, you know, many feet above the sea level rise kind of impact area. We were looking at where it kind of the river comes out.
Okay. Best case
yeah.
scenario, sea level rise area.
Right.
Okay, good.
Yeah, now we get further down the road. That's right.
yeah, I think Mary's speaking to, yeah, longer term, it's going to be, some of the projections are not great, for sure. John.
Yeah, on the reforestation, is there a type of tree or a planting pattern or anything? And you know, can somebody, you know, farm trees on that land and, you know, rotate, you know, the harvesting? Okay.
Yes, and we looked at that in terms of from the for our modeling, we just did a full growth, like 30-year-old stand. So it's not instantaneous, right? Like it takes a little while to get to that. So we just modeled a full tree stand. We didn't do looking at species, but for our cost, we actually looked at mixed pine and hardwoods, and did the kind of cost benefit to know what kind of payment, like, in other words, if our state was to put more money in the forest conservation program, what kind of payments would be required to these landowners. And so there'd be a great option is to convert, say this farm is kind of struggling with issues, water problems, to convert to timber, and that be done in a way that the timber is, you know, the right species for this setting. And that you could even add the berming to that and store water on the timber. And we've got some people in forestry that are starting to look at what that would do. Now, the most vulnerable time is when they're seedlings, but you could have mature pines or mature hardwoods, and if they're flooded for a few days, as long as it's not happening every week, they would be okay. So
Great.
you could actually kind of double up. Like we looked at the measures, this one, this one, this one, but some of them can be stacked on each other in a way. I envision a
Interesting.
farm that maybe they, you know, say the farmer's ready to retire and he's had some tough years, that you could have a stream restoration or wetland with a berm storage. You could have some retimbering and go into forest conservation program. There could be like all the measures mixed on a very large farm.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Well, I think we're probably down to our last question, and I had one that came in that was curious about what individuals might be able to do on their own property. You know, things that they may be able to think about that if we could get a lot of more people doing it, might also, you know, be a benefit.
Plant trees. Trees are the answer. I saw a bumper sticker. Gloria Putnam has it. Trees are the answer. And when we started looking at, you know, like all the kind of carbon modeling and, you know, carbon reduction modeling and flooding, I was like, your bumper sticker's correct, Gloria. Trees are the answer. So yeah, reducing some of that turf grass, having more trees and mulch. I'm thinking about converting my whole backyard. It's so wet by there. I'm thinking about just making all mulch and trees and give up on any grass, you know.
Okay. All right. Well, Dr. Dahl, thank you so much for spending some time, you know, and your personal time to join us. We really appreciate it. This we will have this then up on our website for folks to come back to if there's parts you missed or wanted to kind of look at again. So this was great information. And for the rest of you, also want to let you know that coming up next month, our next Tell Me About It Tuesday, I think it is I believe March 8th, if I have that right, Corinne. It's Dr. Emily Yeager, who's at East Carolina University, and she's working on a project called the Blue Economy Corridor. And we were talking a lot about the news today, which was great, about the flooding kind of in Goldsboro, Kinston area. And Dr. Yeager will be talking about the work that she's doing on the tar related to kind of recreation and ecotourism and building kind of a blue economy along the river. So I hope you all can join us for that one as well. But if you haven't signed up for our e-news, I would hope you all go to soundrivers.org and do that. We send out a weekly message for folks to get information. But again, just wanted to thank you all this evening for being here. And thank you so much, Dr. Dahl.
You're welcome. Thanks for everybody signing in late night like this. Appreciate it.